Captain Jake Sullivan was running calculations on fuel efficiency and profit margins when the proximity alarm started screaming, transforming his peaceful afternoon of routine cargo hauling into the kind of life-threatening emergency that made independent trading in frontier space a profession with notably high mortality rates. 3 ships had emerged from the Veil Nebula's sensor-scrambling clouds, their weapon signatures immediately identifying them as pirates rather than legitimate traffic seeking assistance or commerce. "Well, shit," Jake muttered, his hands moving across control interfaces with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd survived 8 years of frontier trading by being very good at running away from fights he couldn't win. His cargo hauler's steady profit was built for reliability and cargo capacity rather than combat, which meant his tactical options were limited to hoping his engines could outrun whatever the pirates were flying. The pirates had other ideas about his escape prospects. The first missile salvo disabled his primary engines with the kind of precision that suggested these weren't desperate scavengers but professional raiders with military-grade equipment and tactical coordination. Jake's secondary thrusters could maintain basic maneuvering, but escape velocity was no longer an option, leaving him facing the unpleasant choice between surrendering his cargo and hoping the pirates were satisfied with profit rather than violence, or making a futile attempt at armed resistance that would likely end with his ship becoming an expanding cloud of debris. That was when she appeared. A sleek fighter craft materialized from the nebula's concealing radiation-like death-given metallic form, its weapon systems already locked onto the pirate squadron with targeting solutions that suggested whoever was piloting possessed reflexes and tactical analysis capabilities far beyond human norms. The engagement that followed lasted approximately 90 seconds, long enough for Jake to watch in amazement as a single fighter systematically dismantled 3 pirate vessels with the kind of clinical precision that made the battle look less like desperate combat and more like a demonstration of superior technology and training. When the last pirate ship went silent, Jake found himself alone in space with his mysterious rescuer, whose fighter was already maneuvering toward his damaged cargo hauler with obvious intent to dock. His communication system crackled with an incoming transmission, the voice carrying accents that suggested non-human vocal anatomy but perfect clarity in standard Galactic. "Cargo vessel steady profit, this is Kess. Your engine damage appears reparable with standard components. Request permission to dock and provide technical assistance." "Permission granted," Jake replied, still processing the fact that he'd just been saved by someone whose appearance and departure from the nebula suggested she'd been monitoring the region for exactly this kind of situation. "And thank you for the timely rescue. I'm Captain Jake Sullivan." "Acknowledged, Captain Sullivan. Docking in 60 seconds. The woman who entered his cargo bay moved with the kind of fluid grace that immediately marked her as non-human, though her overall appearance was humanoid enough that the differences felt like elegant variations rather than fundamental alien biology. Kess stood slightly taller than Jake's 6 feet, with silver skin that held subtle patterns of darker markings that seemed to shift position when she moved, and ears that curved to delicate points that suggested enhanced auditory capabilities. Her clothing combined functional utility with sophisticated technology. Form-fitting garments that appeared to provide environmental protection while maintaining complete freedom of movement. "Your primary engine coupling has been severed by proximity blast rather than direct impact," she said without preamble, her assessment beginning before Jake could offer proper introductions or expressions of gratitude. "Reparable with standard components if you carry appropriate spare parts inventory." "I do," Jake confirmed, leading her toward the engine compartment while noting that her attention remained focused on technical analysis rather than social interaction. "Are you military? Your tactical skills suggest formal combat training." "I am not affiliated with any military organization," Kess replied, though her tone suggested this was information rather than conversation. "Your engine repairs will require approximately 4 hours assuming standard human work pace and adequate spare parts quality." Jake watched her begin the repair work with the kind of systematic efficiency that suggested extensive mechanical expertise, though her obvious reluctance to engage in casual conversation made him uncertain about whether attempts at friendly interaction would be welcome or simply ignored. "Kess," he said, testing whether she would respond to her name being used in direct address, "I'm curious about how you happen to be in position to intercede when those pirates attacked. Do you patrol this region regularly?" I monitor shipping traffic in areas where independent traders are vulnerable to predation, she replied, her hands moving across his engine systems with confidence that suggested familiarity with human technology despite her alien physiology. Pirates operating in the Vale Nebula region threaten supply lines that serve frontier colonies dependent on regular cargo delivery. So you're some kind of freelance protector of independent shipping? Kes paused in her work long enough to glance at him with eyes that held depths he couldn't interpret, though her expression suggested she was evaluating whether his question required detailed response or could be deflected with minimal information. I ensure that essential supply routes remain functional, she said finally. Your cargo manifest indicates medical supplies and agricultural equipment for Kepler colony. These materials are critical for population survival during the upcoming seasonal transition. Jake felt surprise at the realization that she'd not only monitored his shipping activities but analyzed his cargo in enough detail to understand its importance to the colony he was serving. You've been tracking my routes. I track all independent traders who serve isolated settlements that lack adequate military protection, Kes replied, returning her attention to the engine repairs with obvious intent to avoid further discussion of her monitoring activities. Your shipping pattern indicates reliable service to communities that depend on consistent supply delivery for survival. And you appointed yourself guardian of traders who serve those communities? I ensure that critical supply lines remain disrupted by pirate activity, she corrected, though Jake noticed that her explanation carefully avoided any reference to personal motivation or individual decision-making processes. As the repair work continued, Jake found himself studying Kes with growing curiosity about her background and the obvious competence that allowed her to function as a one-person defense force for independent shipping. Her technical skills were remarkable, her tactical abilities were clearly professional grade, and her knowledge of frontier commerce suggested extensive experience with the challenges facing independent traders in dangerous regions. But her social interaction patterns suggested someone who was either uncomfortable with personal connection or actively avoiding the kind of relationship development that normally occurred when people shared dangerous experiences and cooperative work. Kes, Jake said as she completed the final phases of his engine repair, I'm grateful for your assistance, but I'm curious about something. You've saved my life, spent hours repairing my ship, and clearly invested significant effort in monitoring shipping traffic to provide this kind of protection. But you don't seem interested in conversation, friendship, or any kind of personal connection that might develop from such cooperation. She was quiet for several minutes, testing the engine system she'd repaired while apparently considering whether his observation required response. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something that might have been cautious honesty. Personal connections create vulnerabilities that compromise tactical effectiveness, she said without looking at him. Effective protection of shipping routes requires maintaining objective assessment of threats and resources rather than developing emotional investment in specific individuals or outcomes. That sounds like something you were taught rather than something you concluded from personal experience. Kes's hand stilled on the engine controls, and Jake caught a glimpse of expression that suggested his assessment had touched on areas she preferred to keep private. Your engine repairs are complete, Captain Sullivan. Your ship is fully operational for continued cargo delivery. She moved toward the airlock with obvious intent to return to her fighter and resume whatever monitoring activities occupied her time between rescue operations, but Jake found himself reluctant to let her leave without some acknowledgement of what she'd done and what her assistance meant to him personally. Kes, he called, stopping her at the threshold between his ship and hers. Thank you. For saving my life, for repairing my ship, and for whatever larger purpose drives you to protect traders like me. I know you said personal connections create vulnerabilities, but I want you to know that your help means more than just restored engine function. Her response was a brief nod that might have indicated acknowledgement, though her expression remained carefully neutral. Continue to exercise appropriate caution in dangerous regions, Captain Sullivan. Pirates adapt their tactics based on successful interventions. And then she was gone, her fighter disappearing into the nebula's concealing radiation as efficiently as it had emerged, leaving Jake alone with functional engines and a growing sense that his encounter with Kes had been the beginning of something rather than an isolated incident that would never be repeated. He was right about that, though it would take months for him to understand what kind of relationship was developing between them, and longer still to realize that Kessa's professional distance was protection against exactly the kind of personal connection that might have the power to transform both their lives. 3 months after his first encounter with Kess, Jake had come to expect her mysterious appearances during the most dangerous portions of his cargo runs, though her interventions were always perfectly timed and professionally executed without any acknowledgement that they were developing what most people would consider an ongoing relationship. Her fighter would materialize from sensor shadows whenever pirates threatened his ship, equipment failures occurred in dangerous regions, or navigation hazards created risks that his cargo hauler couldn't handle independently. Each rescue followed the same pattern: efficient elimination of threats, technical assistance provided with minimal conversation, and departure without social interaction that might suggest personal interest in his welfare beyond maintaining functional supply routes to frontier colonies. Jake had begun to suspect that Kess was following his shipping schedule with the kind of detailed attention that indicated she'd made protecting him a personal project, though she consistently deflected his attempts to discuss her motivations or the obvious effort she invested in keeping him alive. Kess to steady profit, came the now familiar transmission as Jake's navigation system detected the engine failure that would have left him drifting in space until his life support systems failed. Your port engine is experiencing cascade failure in the fuel injection system. I have replacement components compatible with your ship specifications. You just happen to be carrying spare parts for my specific engine model? Jake asked as her fighter maneuvered alongside his cargo hauler with the precision that had become characteristic of their encounters. I maintain inventory of components required by ships that serve critical supply routes, Kess replied, though her tone suggested this was standard operating procedure rather than special preparation for his particular vessel. As she worked to repair his engine systems with the same systematic competence that had marked their previous encounters, Jake found himself studying the subtle changes in her behavior that suggested their repeated meetings might be affecting her despite her careful maintenance of professional distance. Kess, he said as she completed the diagnostic phase of his repair, I've been running cargo routes in frontier space for 8 years, and I've never encountered anyone who provides the kind of comprehensive protection service you're offering. Are you sure you're not affiliated with some kind of military or security organization? I am not affiliated with any organization, she replied, though something in her voice suggested that independence might be circumstance rather than choice. Frontier shipping requires protection that official military resources cannot provide due to jurisdiction limitations and resource allocation priorities. So you've appointed yourself unofficial protector of independent traders? I ensure that essential supply lines remain functional, Kess said, repeating the explanation she'd offered during their first encounter but with subtle variations that suggested she was gradually becoming more comfortable with their conversations. Which essential supply lines? All of them, or just specific routes that you've decided are particularly important? Kess paused in her work, her hands stilling on the engine components while she appeared to consider how to respond to a question that touched on areas she preferred to keep private. Routes that serve populations dependent on consistent cargo delivery for survival. Like the medical supply runs I make to Kepler Colony, the agricultural equipment I transport to New Geneva, and the technical components I deliver to the mining operations on Titan Station. Those routes, among others. Jake watched her expression, noting the way her silver skin pattern seemed to shift when she was processing complex thoughts, and the careful way she phrased responses to avoid providing information about her personal decision-making processes. Kess, you've memorized my shipping schedule, you carry spare parts for my specific ship model, and you've intervened in every dangerous situation I've encountered during the past 3 months, he said. That level of attention suggests you're specifically protecting me rather than just maintaining general shipping route security. Your shipping pattern demonstrates reliability in serving isolated settlements, she replied, though her tone suggested she was editing information to maintain privacy about her motivations. Consistent service to dependent populations requires protecting traders who have proven commitment to completing deliveries despite dangerous conditions. And you've identified me as one of those committed traders? Your record indicates completion of 97% of contracted deliveries despite operating in regions where other independents achieve 63% completion rates. Jake felt surprise at the realization that she'd not only monitored his activities but conducted detailed analysis of his performance relative to other traders operating in similar regions. "You've been studying my business operations?" "I analyze all traders who serve critical supply routes to identify those whose protection represents efficient resource allocation," Kes said, though Jake caught something in her expression that suggested her interest in his operations might involve factors beyond pure tactical efficiency. "Efficient resource allocation," Jake repeated. "Is that how you categorize saving my life on multiple occasions?" Kes was quiet for several minutes, completing his engine repair while apparently considering whether his question deserved detailed response or could be deflected with technical discussion. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something that might have been cautious honesty. "Protection of reliable traders produces better outcomes than attempting to improve performance of unreliable operators," she said. "Your demonstrated competence and commitment justify investment of resources in ensuring your continued operation. So you're protecting me because I'm good at my job?" "I am protecting shipping routes that you serve effectively." Jake studied her expression, recognizing the careful distinction she was making between protecting him personally and protecting the function he served in the larger context of frontier commerce. But something about the way she avoided eye contact when discussing her motivations suggested that her explanations were incomplete rather than deliberately deceptive. "Kes," he said as she prepared to depart after completing his repairs, "can I ask you something about your background that might help me understand why you've taken on the role of protector for independent shipping?" "Ask," she replied, though her posture suggested she was prepared to decline to answer questions that ventured into areas she considered too personal. "Your tactical skills, your knowledge of human technology, your obvious familiarity with frontier commerce operations. All of this suggests extensive experience with human civilization despite your alien physiology. But your social interaction patterns suggest someone who's uncomfortable with personal connections. Were you trained for military or security work that required maintaining emotional distance from the people you were protecting?" Kes's silver skin patterns shifted through configurations that Jake had learned to recognize as complex emotional processing, though he couldn't interpret the specific thoughts or feelings they represented. "Nixery cultural training emphasizes objective analysis and tactical effectiveness over personal attachment," she said finally. "The Nixery are your people?" "They were," she said, her voice carrying something that sounded like carefully controlled pain. "Nixery philosophy requires suppression of emotional connections that compromise logical decision-making processes. And you disagree with that philosophy?" "I was determined to be unsuitable for continued integration with Nixery society due to excessive empathic sensitivity and reluctance to prioritize logical efficiency over individual welfare considerations." Jake processed this information while studying her expression, beginning to understand that her isolation might be exile rather than choice, and that her protection of independent traders might be driven by personal values that had brought her into conflict with her own people. "So you were exiled from Nixery society because you cared too much about individual people to maintain the emotional detachment your culture required?" "I was determined to be a liability to operational effectiveness," Kes corrected, though her tone suggested this was official classification rather than personal assessment of her capabilities. "And now you're using the skills that made you a liability to your people to protect traders like me who serve frontier populations that need exactly the kind of individual attention your culture discouraged." Kes looked at him directly for the first time during their conversation, her expression holding something that might have been surprise at his interpretation of her circumstances. "I ensure that essential supply routes remain functional," she said, but without the automatic certainty that had characterized her previous explanations. "Because you care about the individual people who depend on those supply routes, even though caring about individuals is what got you exiled from your own society." "Because..." Kes started, then stopped, her silver patterns cycling through configurations that suggested she was processing thoughts or emotions she rarely acknowledged even to herself. "Because some functions are important regardless of the personal costs associated with performing them effectively." As she departed once again, leaving Jake with functional engines and growing understanding of the complex motivations that drove her protective activities, he realized that their repeated encounters were gradually revealing someone whose apparent emotional detachment concealed depths of caring that had cost her everything she'd once known about home and belonging. Her next intervention would come sooner than expected, and would create opportunities for the kind of conversation that might help both of them understand what kind of relationship was developing between an exiled alien protector and the human trader whose welfare had become important to her for reasons that went beyond tactical efficiency or resource allocation priorities. The crisis that would transform Jake and Kessa's relationship from mysterious protector and grateful beneficiary into genuine partners began with emergency broadcasts from 3 frontier colonies simultaneously reporting coordinated pirate attacks that exceeded the scale of normal raiding activities. Jake received the distress calls while approaching New Geneva with a cargo of agricultural equipment that the colony needed for their upcoming harvest season, but the reports indicated that his destination was among the settlements under siege. All independent traders in the Kepler sector, came the emergency transmission from Colonial Defense Command, be advised that organized pirate forces are conducting systematic attacks on frontier settlements. Recommend immediate cessation of cargo operations and withdrawal to protected space until threat assessment is complete. Jake was calculating whether his cargo was critical enough to justify continuing toward a colony under active attack when Kessa's fighter materialized alongside his ship with the sudden precision that had become familiar during their months of repeated encounters. "Jake," she said, using his given name for the first time rather than the formal address that had characterized their previous communications, "the pirate offensive involves coordinated assault by multiple organizations with military-grade equipment and tactical coordination. This is not standard raiding activity." "How bad are we talking?" Jake asked, noting that her use of his first name suggested the situation was serious enough that normal social protocols were being abandoned for direct communication. 3 colonies under simultaneous assault by forces totaling approximately 50 vessels with coordinated command structure and siege capability, Kess replied. Colonial defense forces are inadequate for sustained resistance against organized military campaign. So the colonies are going to fall unless they receive significant military assistance. Colonial Defense Command has dispatched available resources, but response time will exceed colonial defensive capability by approximately 72 hours, she said. Civilian evacuation will be necessary to prevent massive casualties. Jake studied the tactical displays that showed pirate force concentrations around the 3 targeted colonies, recognizing that his cargo of agricultural equipment would be meaningless if New Geneva's population didn't survive the next few days. What kind of evacuation support can independent traders provide? Cargo vessels modified for passenger transport could evacuate approximately 60% of threatened populations if coordinated efficiently, Kess replied. But such coordination would require central command authority and tactical oversight to prevent evacuation ships from becoming additional targets for pirate interdiction. And you're volunteering to provide that tactical oversight? I am offering to coordinate defensive and evacuation operations if sufficient numbers of independent traders are willing to participate in civilian rescue efforts, she said, though her tone suggested this was a decision she'd already made rather than a proposal under consideration. What followed was the most intense week of Jake's cargo hauling career, as Kess transformed from mysterious individual protector into tactical coordinator for an improvised defense and evacuation effort that involved 23 independent traders, for colonial defense vessels, and civilian populations who needed transport to safer regions before their settlements were overrun by pirate forces with overwhelming technological advantages. Jake's cargo hauler was configured for emergency passenger transport, while his knowledge of shipping routes and civilian logistics made him invaluable for planning evacuation corridors that could move thousands of people without alerting pirate forces to predictable target locations. Working alongside Kess during the crisis revealed aspects of her personality and capabilities that their previous brief encounters had never allowed him to observe. "Evacuation Vessel 7, this is Kess," she transmitted during the coordinated withdrawal from New Geneva, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that kept terrified civilians focused on survival procedures rather than panic. "Pirate interdiction force approaching your route corridor. Alter course to heading 27 Mark 5 and maintain radio silence until you reach safe harbor coordinates." Jake watched her manage 12 simultaneous evacuation operations while coordinating defensive actions that kept pirate forces engaged long enough for civilian transport to reach safety, her tactical expertise creating solutions that saved lives through precise timing and resource allocation that no single pilot could have achieved independently. "Kess," he said during a brief respite between evacuation runs, "Your command capabilities are remarkable." This level of tactical coordination suggests formal military training rather than just individual combat expertise. Nixery education includes strategic analysis and resource management for large-scale operations, she replied, though her attention remained focused on monitoring displays that tracked evacuation progress and threat assessments. Coordination of multiple assets toward common objectives is standard curriculum rather than specialized training. So all Nixery receive education that would qualify them for military command positions? Nixery philosophy emphasizes logical efficiency in all undertakings. Strategic thinking and resource optimization are considered fundamental life skills rather than professional specializations. Jake found himself wondering what kind of society produced individuals with such comprehensive analytical capabilities, and why someone with her obvious competence had been exiled for empathic sensitivity that seemed to enhance rather than compromise her effectiveness in protecting civilian populations. The civilians were evacuating, he observed as they prepared for another transport run. You're treating them as individuals whose welfare matters personally to you rather than just tactical objectives to be achieved efficiently. Effective evacuation requires understanding civilian psychology and individual needs rather than treating population groups as statistical abstractions, Kess replied, though Jake noticed that her silver skin patterns had shifted to configurations he was beginning to recognize as emotional complexity beneath analytical responses. That sounds like the empathic sensitivity that got you exiled from Nixery society. It is the empathic sensitivity that interferes with optimal tactical decision-making according to Nixery evaluation criteria, she confirmed. Emotional investment in individual welfare creates hesitation and resource allocation inefficiencies that compromise overall operational success. But it also creates motivation and personal investment that makes you willing to risk your life to coordinate evacuation efforts that save thousands of people who would otherwise die. Kess was quiet for several minutes, monitoring communication channels while apparently processing the implications of his observation. Optimal tactical efficiency is not always optimal outcome achievement, she said finally. Meaning that caring about individual welfare sometimes produces better results than purely logical resource allocation, even if such caring creates emotional vulnerabilities that Nixery philosophy considers unacceptable. The successful evacuation of all three threatened colonies was achieved through cooperation and sacrifice that created bonds between the participants, but Jake noticed that Kess's reaction to the gratitude and celebration that followed their victory revealed how uncomfortable she became when people attempted to express personal appreciation for her leadership during the crisis. "Commander Kess," said Captain Rodriguez of the Colonial Defense Force as they reviewed final evacuation statistics, "your coordination of civilian rescue operations prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. The colonies owe you a debt that can never be adequately repaid." The evacuation was successful due to cooperation from multiple independent traders and effective resource allocation rather than individual contribution, Kess replied, deflecting personal recognition with the same systematic efficiency she applied to tactical problems. Jake watched her discomfort with expressions of gratitude and began to understand that her exile from Nixery society had left her uncertain about how to process appreciation for qualities that her own people had considered flaws rather than assets. "Kess," he said as they prepared to depart the Evacuation Coordination Center, "you just saved the lives of approximately 15,000 people through tactical brilliance and personal courage that went far beyond anything required by duty or obligation. People want to thank you personally because what you did mattered to them as individuals, not just as statistical achievements. Personal gratitude creates expectations for future performance that may not be sustainable under different operational conditions," she replied, though her voice carried uncertainty rather than the confident certainty that had characterized her explanations during their earlier encounters. "Or personal gratitude creates connections with people who appreciate your capabilities and want to support your efforts rather than just benefit from them," Jake suggested. "Maybe what your people considered emotional vulnerability is actually emotional strength that allows you to accomplish things that purely logical approaches couldn't achieve." As they returned to their respective ships to resume normal cargo operations after the crisis had passed, Jake realized that the week they'd spent working together had revealed the foundation for partnership that could provide both of them with something they'd been missing, for him, purpose beyond simply moving cargo between settlements, and for her acceptance of the empathic qualities that had cost her everything she'd once known about home and belonging. The question was whether either of them would be brave enough to acknowledge that what they'd built during the crisis was worth preserving and developing beyond emergency cooperation into something that resembled the personal connection Kes had been trained to avoid and Jake had never expected to find with someone whose background and capabilities made her seem far beyond his social reach. 2 weeks after the evacuation crisis that had transformed their relationship from mysterious encounters into genuine partnership, Jake and Kes were conducting final equipment checks aboard the Steady Prophet before he resumed cargo runs that would take them back to separate operational areas. The week they'd spent coordinating rescue efforts had created the kind of professional and personal compatibility that made their impending separation feel like an unnecessary loss of something valuable they'd accidentally discovered. Primary life support systems show optimal functionality, Kes reported as she completed diagnostic procedures on equipment she'd helped him repair multiple times during their months of repeated encounters. Secondary backup systems operational within normal parameters. Cargo bay environmental controls configured for standard freight rather than passenger transport, Jake added, checking systems they'd modified for civilian evacuation and now returned to normal shipping configuration. Though I have to admit, hauling people was more meaningful than hauling agricultural equipment. The evacuation operations utilized your logistical expertise more effectively than routine cargo delivery, Kes agreed, though her tone suggested she was processing thoughts about their collaboration that went beyond tactical assessment of mission effectiveness. They worked together with the comfortable efficiency that had developed during their crisis partnership, but Jake found himself reluctant to complete the checks that would signal the end of their extended cooperation and return to whatever pattern of distant protection and grateful acknowledgement had characterized their relationship before the colonies needed coordinated defense. Kes, he said as they moved to the final system that required verification, I want to ask you something about your plans now that the pirate threat has been eliminated and normal shipping operations can resume. Ask, she replied, though her attention seemed focused on technical readings rather than conversation. Are you planning to return to your usual pattern of monitoring shipping routes and providing individual protection when circumstances require intervention? Frontier shipping requires protection that official military resources cannot provide consistently, she said, repeating explanations she'd offered during their early encounters but without the confident certainty that had characterized those interactions. That's not really an answer to my question about your plans. I'm asking whether you want to continue operating alone, or whether our partnership during the evacuation demonstrated possibilities for cooperation that might be worth exploring on a permanent basis. Kes paused in her diagnostic work, her silver skin patterns shifting through configurations that Jake had learned to recognize as complex emotional processing. Partnership requires compatibility of objectives and operational methods, which we demonstrated during the evacuation crisis, Jake pointed out. Your tactical expertise combined with my logistical knowledge produced better results than either of us could have achieved independently. Temporary cooperation during emergency situations does not necessarily predict successful long-term partnership under normal operational conditions. 2 weeks after the evacuation crisis that had transformed their relationship from mysterious encounters into genuine partnership, Jake and Kes were conducting final equipment checks aboard the Steady Prophet before he resumed cargo runs that would take them back to separate operational areas. The week they'd spent coordinating rescue efforts had created the kind of professional and personal compatibility that made their impending separation feel like an unnecessary loss of something valuable they'd accidentally discovered. Primary life support systems show optimal functionality, Kes reported as she completed diagnostic procedures on equipment she'd helped him repair multiple times during their months of repeated encounters. Secondary backup systems operational within normal parameters. Cargo bay environmental controls configured for standard freight rather than passenger transport, Jake added, checking systems they'd modified for civilian evacuation and now returned to normal shipping configuration. Though I have to admit, hauling people was more meaningful than hauling agricultural equipment. The evacuation operations utilized your logistical expertise more effectively than routine cargo delivery, Kes agreed, though her tone suggested she was processing thoughts about their collaboration that went beyond tactical assessment of mission effectiveness. They worked together with the comfortable efficiency that had developed during their crisis partnership, but Jake found himself reluctant to complete the checks that would signal the end of their extended cooperation and return to whatever pattern of distant protection and grateful acknowledgement had characterized their relationship before the colony's needed coordinated defense. "Kes," he said as they moved to the final system that required verification, "I want to ask you something about your plans now that the pirate threat has been eliminated and normal shipping operations can resume." "Ask," she replied, though her attention seemed focused on technical readings rather than conversation. "Are you planning to return to your usual pattern of monitoring shipping routes and providing individual protection when circumstances require intervention? Frontier shipping requires protection that official military resources cannot provide consistently," she said, repeating explanations she'd offered during their early encounters but without the confident certainty that had characterized those interactions. "That's not really an answer to my question about your plans. I'm asking whether you want to continue operating alone, or whether our partnership during the evacuation demonstrated possibilities for cooperation that might be worth exploring on a permanent basis." Kes paused in her diagnostic work, her silver skin patterns shifting through configurations that Jake had learned to recognize as complex emotional processing. "Partnership requires compatibility of objectives and operational methods, which we demonstrated during the evacuation crisis," Jake pointed out. "Your tactical expertise combined with my logistical knowledge produced better results than either of us could have achieved independently. Temporary cooperation during emergency situations does not necessarily predict successful long-term partnership under normal operational conditions." Jake studied her expression, recognizing the careful way she was avoiding direct acknowledgement of what had developed between them during their weeks of working together. "Kes, are you concerned about operational compatibility, or are you worried about the personal connection that's been developing alongside our professional partnership? Personal connections create vulnerabilities that got you exiled from your people because you cared too much about individual welfare to maintain proper emotional detachment," Jake interrupted gently. "But maybe what your people considered weakness was actually strength that allows you to accomplish things that pure logic couldn't achieve." Before Kes could respond, Jake's diagnostic scanner began emitting the urgent alarm that indicated critical system failure. He turned toward the control panel just as a hairline crack in the primary atmospheric processor spread into explosive decompression that would have vented the cargo bay's entire atmosphere within minutes if Kes hadn't detected the failure and activated emergency containment protocols with reflexes that saved both their lives. "Emergency seals engaged," she reported, her hands moving across control interfaces with the practiced efficiency that had preserved his ship's atmospheric integrity. "Pressure stabilized within acceptable parameters." Jake stared at the readings that showed how close they'd come to explosive decompression, then at Kes, whose enhanced senses and rapid response had prevented what would have been a fatal equipment failure. The magnitude of what she'd just prevented, and the casual competence with which she'd handled a crisis that would have killed him without her intervention, made his automatic response emerge without conscious thought. "Thanks, love," he said, the endearment flowing naturally from months of growing affection and the recognition that she'd once again saved his life through capabilities and dedication that went far beyond professional obligation. Kes froze. Her body stiffened as if she'd been struck by something that caused physical rather than emotional shock. Her eyes widened with an expression Jake had never seen before, not surprise or confusion, but something that looked like wonder mixed with disbelief. She turned slowly to face him, her lips parted as if she was trying to process language that didn't translate into familiar concepts. "What did you say?" she whispered, her voice carrying none of the controlled certainty that had characterized every previous conversation they'd shared. "I said thank you," Jake replied, suddenly uncertain about whether his casual endearment had violated some cultural boundary he didn't understand. "For saving my life. Again. You called me, love." The word seemed to catch in her throat as if she was testing unfamiliar pronunciation. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks as he realized that his automatic expression of affection had revealed feelings he'd been developing but hadn't consciously decided to acknowledge. Yes. I did. I'm sorry if that was inappropriate or if it violated some cultural protocol I don't understand. No one has ever. Kes started, then stopped, her silver pattern cycling through configurations that Jake recognized as profound emotional complexity. In Nixery language, in Standard, in any language I know, no one has ever used that word about me. The revelation that hit Jake like a physical blow was the understanding that Kessa's entire existence had been defined by functional relationships where her value was measured by her capabilities rather than her worth as a person deserving of affection and care. "Kess," he said gently, moving closer while recognizing that this moment was more significant than any crisis they'd navigated together, "you've spent months risking your life to protect me, demonstrated tactical brilliance that saved thousands of people during the evacuation, and shown patience and competence that's made our partnership the most meaningful relationship I've experienced in years of independent trading." "Those are functional assessments," she replied, though her voice carried uncertainty rather than the analytical confidence that usually characterized her responses. "Those are reasons why I care about you as a person rather than just appreciating your professional capabilities," Jake corrected. And caring about someone, really caring about them, makes expressions like love feel natural rather than calculated. "Care about me as a person," Kess repeated the concept as if it belonged to a theoretical framework she'd studied but never experienced. "Care about your welfare, your happiness, your sense of belonging and purpose. Care about spending time with you because I enjoy your company, not just because our cooperation produces efficient outcomes." Jake paused, recognizing that his next words would determine whether their relationship could evolve beyond professional partnership into something more personal. "Care about you enough that the thought of going back to separate operational areas feels like losing something important rather than returning to normal independence." Kess was very still, her enhanced senses apparently processing not just his words but emotional states that her empathic abilities could detect with accuracy that human perception couldn't match. "You want me to stay with you? I want to build something together that goes beyond crisis cooperation or protective intervention," Jake confirmed. "Partnership that combines your tactical expertise with my logistical knowledge, your cultural wisdom with my commercial experience, your strength with my, well, whatever qualities I possess that complement your capabilities." Even knowing that partnership with someone who was exiled for excessive empathic sensitivity might create exactly the kinds of emotional vulnerabilities that Nixery philosophy considers operationally unacceptable. Especially knowing that, Jake said, reaching out to touch her face with the kind of gentle reverence that acknowledged both her alien beauty and the courage required to trust someone with emotional territory she'd never been allowed to explore. "Because your empathic sensitivity is what makes you care about people in ways that produce better outcomes than pure logical efficiency could achieve." Kessa's response was to step closer with the kind of natural grace that made their height difference irrelevant and their species differences feel like complementary variations rather than fundamental incompatibilities. When she spoke, her voice carried something Jake had never heard before, hope mixed with wonder at possibilities she'd never imagined were available to someone like her. "Jake Sullivan," she said, using his full name with the careful pronunciation that suggested it had become important to her, "I want to learn what it means to be called love by someone who sees value in qualities that my own people considered flaws." "I want to teach you," Jake replied, "and learn from you about strength and competence and the kind of caring that saves lives while building relationships that make everything else more meaningful." As they stood together in the cargo bay where her quick thinking had once again preserved his life, Jake realized that his casual endearment had indeed changed everything, not by revealing hidden feelings, but by creating the opportunity for both of them to acknowledge that what they'd built together was worth preserving and developing into something that provided both of them with the connection they'd been missing without realizing how much they needed it. 6 months later, the Steady Prophet operated with 2-person crew, its cargo runs expanded to include specialized missions that required both logistical expertise and tactical oversight. Jake's shipping business had evolved into something approaching a small-scale civilian protection service, while Kess had discovered that partnership with someone who valued her empathic sensitivity could provide the sense of belonging and purpose that exile from her people had taken away. "Thanks, love," had become Jake's standard expression of gratitude for Kessa's continued protection and partnership, while her response, "You are welcome, my Jake," demonstrated how someone who had never experienced affection could learn to give and receive it when offered by someone who understood that love was recognition of worth rather than assessment of utility. Their relationship proved that sometimes the most important words were the ones that revealed how much someone mattered to you, and that the best partnerships developed when people were brave enough to acknowledge feelings that transformed professional respect into personal connection that made every challenge worth facing together.